Welcome back to the Building Bigger Lives podcast. I'm Kathryn Peterson here with my co-host, Michael Regan. And today we're going to talk about something that some people like to ignore, which is the details. So it's all in the details. And as we start getting more business and we're hearing more about loan volumes and purchase volumes, if you're a real estate agent, it's time now, really, before we get busy, to dig into those details because they do make the difference for the client experience and the experience of all of our partners throughout the transaction. So, Michael, I know you have a story to lead us into that, and I'm excited to talk to you about this today. I'm going to welcome Michael Regan.
Thank you, Kathryn. Yeah, I definitely have a story for this one. And do you remember? I don't know. Most people tend to watch the Super Bowl for football, but some of us like to watch for the commercials at halftime. And I don't know if you'll remember this, but it was probably a Super Bowl or two back where Workday had a sponsorship, and the Workday sponsor was all around this theme of calling people at work a rock star. Did you happen to catch this commercial on the Super Bowl? Okay. So some of the audience is nodding. They're like, "Oh yeah, I remember that one." It was a great, almost a parody of the way that this term has been entered into our lexicon. We see this now in real estate, where if someone's doing really well, "Oh, she's a rock star," or if
Right.
in lending someone has a really good teammate, "Oh, my processor is a rock star," and the ad was basically featuring real life rock stars in an office environment, saying, "You're not a rock star." Like the idea was a real rock star
Yeah.
is a very real thing. And as I grew up, one of the rock stars that I remember that was just larger than life in the late 70s and early 80s was a guy by the name of David Lee Roth. I don't know if that name rings a bell, but he was the
Yeah. I know the
very
name.
all right, good. He was the very charismatic frontman of a band called Van Halen, who later had a change in singers, and that's a whole nother story that I won't get into. But when Dave was still in the band, and the band was just on fire, they were one of the most popular American rock bands on tour, and really building these bigger and bigger and bigger um, stage setups as they would tour arenas all around the country. They began to put in their rider for their contracts this little known clause, and it became kind of legendary. It was the no brown M&Ms clause, and no brown M&Ms became synonymous with Van Halen because the legend that came out of this clause was, oh my gosh, what a bunch of prima donna rock stars. They're going to actually make, some kid go backstage at every show and make sure they've got, food and beer and Jack Daniels and a bowl of M&Ms, and they have to pick all the brown ones out. Like, what a bunch of prima donnas. Um, Come to find out years later that it was all in the details. What we learned later, when Dave has since recounted that story, was back in the 70s, you can imagine rigging for these setups and stages was a really manual process. Like, we didn't have some of the
Mhm.
technology we have today that's maybe lighter weight. The lights were heavy, speakers were heavy, everything was heavy. And the amount of tonnage in the, 6 or 8 semis they would use to haul around got immense. And they go from town to town, and they have to have a certain amount of gear set up ahead of time so that when their crew arrives with the Van Halen gear, they're basically building on the setup that gets done by the
Mhm.
local promoter. And the only way they could come up with to make sure that the promoters had read all of the details in the contract for each concert was to put this little no brown M&Ms
Mhm.
clause in the rider. And the whole point of it was, if they walked into a building for a show on the day of the show and went backstage and saw their food and their beer and their whiskey and a bowl of M&Ms that had brown M&Ms in it, they knew at that very moment they hadn't read the contract. And if they hadn't read the contract on this stupid bowl of M&Ms, they probably hadn't read the contract on exactly what was required to hold all of this immense production that they were bringing into that arena, which meant real people's lives were at danger. The crew was in danger, the band was in danger, maybe even fans
Mhm.
could be in danger if any of this stuff were to collapse during a show. So the band would use this clause as a way to make sure that the contract had been read. And if they saw brown M&Ms, oh, part of the clause, by the way, was they had permission then to trash the venue. They would completely trash
Oh.
their backstage room and refuse to go on stage until the production was right, and that the local promoter had made it right. And it created a ton of tension. But I think the takeaway from this story was these guys turned out, instead of being pot smoking rock stars,
Yeah.
turned out to be pretty dang smart, pretty genius. They knew how to get the attention because they didn't have the luxury of going in and previewing this ahead of time. They had been in, St. Louis the night before, and tonight they're in Kansas City. They can't get in there, and they have to make sure it's done right. So I share this story because many of us in real estate find out that it's all in the details
Mhm.
after it's too late. This happens
Mhm.
all the time. You and I have seen real estate contracts. Don't believe for a second they're boilerplate. Every one of them is full of details that, if we don't understand up front, can create serious stress. The lending process, full of details. And if we don't understand those details, whether it's an LOA, a processor, or the originator themselves, they and the client can experience real stress. So I set up that story to ask you a few questions, Kathryn, because you're an expert in
Mhm.
this field. And I think a lot of our listeners come from this field. As you hear that, let's maybe back up at the beginning of the process. When you're first meeting a prospective client, maybe someone you haven't worked with before, they've been referred to you, maybe by one of your local agents. What are some of the details early on in that process that you look back later and think, I wish I had asked that question, or I wish I had understood that earlier in the process? What are some of the things that come to mind in that early
Mhm.
consultation process that are a little bit like the brown M&M story?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's some pieces um, that we've added to our list or that sometimes get missed. One of them is, where are you going to be for closing? Are you physically going to be here? Are you not? What does that look like? Is everybody going to be here? Because sometimes there'll be someone who tells them, oh, you don't actually have to be here for closing. You can just do an e-sig, just like the contracts. Well, that's not quite the case. So there's certain of those details that can be big. Another one would be, tell me exactly where the money for the down payment is coming from. And not, oh yeah, I have it in, my bank account, but which one? And and then later even though we ask, we might find out that they just transferred that money in there 2 days ago from a friend or who knows. So it's digging into those details that can really bite you later.
Yeah, those are a couple of really great examples. You're triggered in my mind, several things that come to play even at the credit review. You're looking at someone's credit. What are some of those little moments where at that moment you're getting a snapshot, but of course it's a today and looking backward. What are some of the things that can happen the day after that credit review that you think later, oh, I wish I had explained that to them more clearly because that turned out to be a real fly in the ointment?
Yeah, so what about they go buy a car or there's a credit inquiry or they decide not to make any payments because they finally found a house and those kind of things can definitely make a difference as well. Hopefully there's less people doing that than there maybe has
Sure.
been with enough prep, but yeah, those things definitely come up.
So then move me through that process. At some point, you're getting
Mhm.
someone pre-approved, and as they go out, and let's use a purchase scenario because I think that's a little bit more of the standard process. I realize there's a slightly different modified process for someone who might be refinancing their loan. But
Mhm.
today, let's talk about purchase. So someone's pre-approved. They're going out. They're looking at homes, but maybe in the market they live in, it's not like, hey, I'm pre-approved. I found a home. We write an offer and we close in a couple of weeks. Maybe there's some space in between those events.
Mhm.
Maybe it takes a while to find the right house, or maybe it takes a while to get the right offer to match up with the right seller to agree to it. What are some of the things during that stage of the process where we're not technically under contract yet, but they think they're pre-approved? What are some other questions that later we say, oh, that would have been good to ask or good to clarify while you're out shopping for a home?
Yeah, definitely things like, do you have a change in income? Did you switch from salary to commission? Did you, it did you break up with the person that you're going to purchase with? So many different things happen. What's happening to those funds for closing? Did you spend them after we met about the pre-approval? Did you drop your hours? So there's so many things that can come up and do come up that we just have to pivot when those things happen.
I imagine on the real estate side, there's a similar set of these things that happen because I imagine being an agent who's responsible. You know, now we talked about the NAR settlement, and we're on the other side of that, and thankfully that seems to be going pretty smoothly so far. But our agents on the street know that they're now having to communicate up front a little bit differently
Mhm.
when they're going
Mhm.
out to represent a buyer than they might have had to communicate in the past. It's a little more acute. It's a little tighter. They're a little more clear. What are some of the things you might imagine now that they might be dealing with that cause them a little bit of stress down the road once they're ready to write an offer? What are some of the things that they might be managing during that same period of time that you're managing things as a lender?
Yeah, it definitely can be stuff of if the seller isn't paying, what's the buyer going to do for those funds? Is that figured out ahead of time? One that comes up frequently here is there's a blank on our contracts that says the seller will be paying, well, the buyer and seller will split the closing cost at which is the title closing fee, which is a $300 to $500 fee. That's a blank on the contract, but a lot of clients will read that and think that the seller's paying for half of their total closing costs. So
Mhm.
some of those things are just not clarified. And then I'll go to them and say, no, that's not how the contract reads. The contract reads this.
Yeah.
And that can mess with things. Same thing with who's paying for title, who's paying for things. What if there's a problem? What do the dates actually mean for the clients? So really this business is all about the details.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you phrased it that way because that's why we titled this episode as such. Is sometimes when we've been through a season like we've been in over the last 2.5 years, our transactional activity has plateaued a little bit. And those of us who are still alive and well in this business, we've fought hard to be in a position
Mhm,
like we're in today. So I don't expect I'm speaking to people who aren't real pros doing real great work. But sometimes our skill sets atrophy a bit when we're not using them every day, when we're not
mhm,
in such high capacity, high intensity transactional activity. And so we get a little bit lax on these details. And it's not intentional, but we figure it out later that, oh my gosh, I used to ask that and I forgot
mhm,
this time. And granted, I didn't do anything wrong, but it starts to look bad on me because the person on the other end is a consumer. They don't
mhm.
do this professionally. They're counting on the realtor and the lender to ask these questions. Um, okay, let's move forward in the process. We've got, a snapshot of what it's like when someone's getting pre-approved. We have a snapshot of what they're like, what that experience is like when they're maybe hunting for the right match. But at some point, they've found that property. They do write that offer, and through some process of negotiation, it gets accepted. What starts to happen at that phase in the process? Where do some of the details show up that we think later, maybe at the closing table or even post closing, that, oh my gosh, nobody told us about this. And I wish we had asked that question right when we got under contract.
Yeah, so one of the things I hear about sometimes post-close is utility costs, and, it may be that they have an idea, but they, maybe didn't get a copy of the bills to show what that looks like, and then it might be a little different from the prior owner. What if the prior owner wasn't there very often? Or what if they just kind of were one of those people who always turned off the lights and you're the type that always has the lights on? So just having some variation among that. I think the other piece is exactly what that payment is going to be, what it includes, what it doesn't include, what the homeowners association fees include and don't include. That all becomes really important at that point, and exactly what that process is going to be as well. I think people get a little confused and overwhelmed by.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And as you get, to that closing table, you've got a deadline. And so there's enough stress already baked into a clock that's ticking because there's a certain symmetry that has to line up at that moment. You've got a lender who's delivering documentation for a
Mhm.
loan. You've got a person who owns that home who's trying to move their stuff out. And you've got a person who's moving in who wants to, I mean, all these things have to converge in a very short period of time. And of course, everybody would like that to be just seamless and stress free, which is, I think, how most of us talk about the process
Mhm.
up front. But sometimes these little details are what keep it from feeling stress free.
Mhm.
And the concern I have for folks that live in the shoes that I know you live in is sometimes we can do everything with excellence, and that one little thing at the end becomes the thing that everybody remembers, and they decide
Mhm.
to judge their experience based on, well, nobody told me that gas bill was going to be like this, and somehow that becomes a negative reflection, a little bit of a, I don't know, a regret instead of a celebration.
Yeah.
Um, any of those experiences that you've ever had to handle with either an agent or with a consumer who've maybe gone through a process that you felt, hey, trust me, this went really well considering how difficult it was, but they can't see it that way. They only see it as, well, it wasn't perfect and I'm not
Mhm.
happy. Have you ever seen that happen?
Yeah, most people are pretty it depends on the client because a lot of them don't know what to expect. So they're that in some ways can be good because they're like, okay, if you need it, I'll send it to you. Versus sometimes if you have somebody who's done it a whole bunch, they're like, I've never needed this before. Why do I need it now? So I think that it just depends a little bit on the person. I think most people will end up at the closing happy, but it's just walking them through those things of I don't know how to use a computer, but I have to log into my bank and get this. And, hey, yes, we can walk you through it, but there might be some points of frustration because they've never used print to PDF before, let's say. So I think some of it is just keeping in close contact to make sure that they understand some of the details that we are working with, and then trying to catch the ones you can. Is the insurance have the middle initial or not? Is the middle initial wrong? Is it missing lane? Is it for the right amount? So you start to dive into these and you start realizing, holy cow, there's a lot involved just to get to the closing table. And a lot of that we don't need our clients to know, but sometimes we also need their help in getting things fixed and we're going to have to reach out to them. But we're all on this team together.
As I listen to you recounting a couple of those examples, I think of our friend Roy Michelle,
Mhm.
who told me one time the way he would describe his process for jumbo loans during a season when jumbo loans were difficult to originate and difficult to close because there just weren't as many investors willing to compete for that business. So it was a little bit of a difficult season. He said, I used to tell people that this is a little bit like I have a direct flight to your destination and I'm a professional pilot. But in order to get you from where we sit today to the destination you're trying to get to, there's a storm and we're going to have to fly above it and then through it to land. So I'm going to tell you up front, there's going to be a little bit of
Mhm.
turbulence. And I need you to
Mhm.
understand that this is not the flight where you're going to get a nice meal and we're going to clink, glasses and we're going to be buckled in because there's some turbulence along the way. But if I tell you that ahead of time and tell you I can get you there safely and you're going to be really happy once you get to your destination, that's your alternative to booking some flight through 3 other cities to try to get around that storm and having to deal with all kinds of variables as you make transfers in 3 different airports in order to avoid that storm. If you'll trust me as the expert pilot, I will get you there safely. I just need you to buckle in and not complain about the turbulence because it's going to come. And I remember him explaining that thing. Boy, how smart is that? Because you're setting the tone up front to
Mhm.
say, I'm an expert pilot. I'm in control.
Yeah.
I am not afraid to take this flight, but I don't need you sitting back there complaining because we can't get drink service. Like, just stay buckled, be safe. And when I need you, I promise I will let you know. And that was such a great articulation of getting the mindset right up front. And then some of the things you were explaining, some of those details, whether it's middle initials or small, pieces or seemingly small pieces, but ones that can be really significant,
Yeah.
including things like how we record title. I mean, how many people have shown up saying, "Oh, well, I wanted that to be held in trust," and they didn't know ahead of time. Well, but we're not lending to a trust. We're lending to you, and yes, that can be done post closing. But there's this anxiety at that moment of, well, I wasn't prepared for that. Just
Yeah.
think of so many of these details that you and many of our audience manage. It's incredible. I think you all are just incredible masters of managing details because this business requires it. All right, one last scenario for you. So let's say we're past all those little turbulence moments and the plane did land. These folks did get off at their destination and they're really happy to be there. So in this scenario, they've moved in, life's good, they're living in the house. I know you're a big believer in serving those clients. You don't believe in past clients. They're always your clients. It's just those were past transactions, but you're always actively engaging. What are some of the things you've learned over the years that have helped you better set up that phase of the relationship where maybe in the past you'd say, oh, I could have explained that detail a little better up front in order to maintain that relationship post closing?
Yes, I think it starts at closing where you say, hey, we're going to be staying in touch. We're going to send you this tool at about 6 months. We're going to reach out at 3, 6, 9, 12 months to touch base. Here's what to expect from us. Because then they're expecting the phone call, they're expecting the communication. And then you actually have to do that. And I think the big points are when they get their escrow statement, when they have to make their first payment, and if something happens, let's say they could get rid of mortgage insurance and the refi opportunities that come up. And there's those points along the process that you have to reach out proactively to the clients and be there when they need you if a question pops up. So and sometimes I'm surprised people will wait for that call and say, "Oh, good, I had a question a month ago, and I just figured I'd wait till the 6 month call." And I was like, "Oh, wait, you can reach out anytime." But they're expecting it and they're planning on it and they're thinking of questions in advance. So it's definitely a helpful point. And then when they get their escrow statement, they are not surprised. Or if they are, we can go through why it is what it is and go through those questions for them.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, as I think about that, Catherine, I think our real estate friends are in the same boat. You know, sometimes we don't set the expectation for that ongoing relationship, and so if we don't, it can feel clunky or awkward. The person on the other end may feel like, "Oh, is everything okay? Like, why are you call?" Like
Mhm.
they're not sure what's going on. They
Yeah.
thought everything was fine, and the truth might be everything is fine. But part of that proactivity is helping them manage this particular transaction in the context of a much longer term strategy. And so setting up those expectations up front is such a great idea, whether you're in lending or real estate. I think that's a really smart play. You know, most of us use a CRM at some point. And I think in today's data driven world, we've somewhat slid into a season where CRM has become a little bit synonymous with database management, which makes it a very automated process. We want to, put people's data into some sort of database management tool and automate communication. And
Mhm.
I'd love to challenge us to say part of the details is if you want to maintain a relationship, remember CRM originally stood for client relationship manager. So if you're going to manage a relationship with this client, you're going to have to be intentional early or much earlier than you probably think about why you're following up and how that's adding real value to them or clarifying where that value might be. So I'm really glad that you're
Mhm.
highlighting a few of those examples for our audience. So as we maybe pull a wrap on this, are there any other details as you look ahead that you think these are things that maybe don't have to be tied to a specific transaction, but are pretty common in the business that we live in that you think those are details we've really had to learn to manage well or get better information for so that we could be better at consistently doing what we do year after year with our partners. Anything come to mind?
There's so many, but I think one of the things I wanna kind of pivot on a little bit is some ways to keep track of all those details. And because there's so many, if I even start listing them, we're gonna be in the thousands. So I think that, it's kind of taking the feedback from the client and then adding that into some sort of checklist of saying, "Okay, when we get insurance, what's 5 things we're checking every single time? When we get the appraisal, what are we checking for? When we order the appraisal, what are we checking for?" And kind of having some sort of guide for people along the way can make life a lot easier, because we have things in here, but if they're not translated and we don't know that they're done, that makes it difficult. So I think having some solution-based checklists can be really helpful in keeping track of all these details. Did we check the name on the contract? Did we check to make sure we have the right closing date? Does the closing date match up with what everyone else has? Is it on a Sunday? Things like that can be really important, but you have to have ways in your process to keep track of those. You have to have ways in your process to know what you're talking to them at closing, to know what you're talking to them about at the annual review, to know what you're talking about at the prelim appointment. And honestly, people think, oh, I'm going to be able to keep track of these in my head, and you just can't. I still have a list on my computer of everything I talk about at the initial appointment, and there's still things I sometimes forget. So it's impossible to keep track of everything unless you have it written down somewhere.
So what you're saying, I'm going to put a different word to it, is
Yeah.
you've created systems.
Yes.
And what we learned when we read Atomic Habits a couple years ago was we don't tend to, as professionals, we don't tend to rise to the level of our goals. We tend to fall to the level of our systems. And if we've got really good systems, we don't have to fall very far. Our systems catch us. You called them, like a checklist. Those are proactively designing the things that we know need to be covered, all those details, and not giving yourself permission to forget about them because they're right there on the list. So as long as you work through the list, you don't forget. And I hope our audience hears that some of us are very detail oriented by nature, others of us less. But anyone who's going to sustain a business and scale it to any measurable level is going to benefit from systems. So I'm so glad you brought up that example in closing, because you're right. These aren't just little, example moments that happen. There are some things that happen every time that you can systematize. And if you systematize them, then your questions get asked, your details get uncovered quickly, and your stress level goes down. And I hope that's what our audience takes away from today's episode, is just like the No Brown M&M story. There's no reason not to have a great concert. There's no reason not to have a really great transactional experience. If you get really good at the details and managing those through your systems, everybody can have a stress-free experience. And I do appreciate what you said in the setup. I think we are entering into a season where we might see a nice long run of steady growth in real estate, transactional activity. And if that's true, I want all of us to feel ready for that. And I'm really glad we talked today about the details. Thanks for bringing that to light, Kathryn, and thanks for letting me share a good rock and roll story, because that's fun for me.
That's right. We have two things: sports analogies and music analogies. So I'm glad we can wrap one of those two in. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to close out this episode of Building Bigger Lives. Today, we talked about how it's all in the details and went through what some of those details were, how to keep track of them. And for us, please find us on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts, and look at those details. If you see a typo, let me know, right? And please listen, please share. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Michael, for being here, and we'll see you next time.